And yes, I believe we are recording. So without further ado, Rob, great to see you, and thank you for the second session of Anglicanism 101. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremiah. This is it's a great privilege to do this, and thank you all for coming. I will warn you. I was telling Jeremiah earlier that I made what is potentially the unwise choice of setting today as like 400 years worth of material, and so I worry that I might not time myself in the most effective way. So hopefully we'll get through the stuff, and it's necessarily, I think, going to be something of a more broad overview than last week. So for last week, we got into the weeds a little bit on the English Reformation. This week we're covering like the 17th through the 20th century, so it's a little bit higher level, a little broader. So last week we hit on Henry VIII and the English Reformation, the divorce controversy, and all of the kind of back and forth with the succeeding monarchs, moving between whether we're going to be a Protestant church or a Catholic church. What exactly is this English church going to look like? And we concluded with Queen Elizabeth. And she set up this religious settlement that was intentionally broad. And under Elizabeth, she wanted to have a church that most people could accept, and that was sort of creating the best of all the worlds, right? And this was the Via Media, and that's where we'll pick up today with this sort of Via Media. So, so sorry, my child has just shown up in the room. I don't know, Matt, but I'm in the middle of something, you know. This is, Zoom teaching, right? Now I've lost my mojo. Oh yeah, here we go. So I've got three sort of trends. So I want to hit on three trends of sort of Anglicanism through the centuries. One is the idea that as a church, the Anglican Church was committed to being both a biblical and a liturgical church, right? Holding together biblical and liturgical. Second, I want to pull the strand of Anglicanism as a church that is broad, a church that encompasses a number of different viewpoints, which occasionally leads to schism or to tension or conflict within that church. And then I want to look at Anglicanism as a missionary church, as a church that has started in England, but that is going to spread worldwide, right? We're not in England, but we're Anglicans, and Anglicanism is all over the world. I want to look a little bit at how that happened. Okay, so I want to start with biblical and liturgical. So this is kind of building off of what Queen Elizabeth did, right? Elizabeth says we want to get the best of what is the Protestant contribution, and we want to get the best of what is the Catholic contribution. We want to retain the liturgy and the ceremony and that piece that is good from Catholicism as much as we can. We also want to integrate the biblicism and the focus on the scriptures that the continental Protestants are promoting. And so what you end up with in early Anglicanism is two really consequential documents, two pieces of literature, as it were, that illustrate this, I think, really, really well. So we talked a little bit last week about the Book of Common Prayer. So Bishop Cranmer writes this prayer book of English prayers and services and sacraments to be used in the English church. It continues to be in use today. It's been updated a number of times. I think this is actually an 18th century cover sheet here that I've put here. But that illustrates the liturgical piece, right? Anglicanism is intentionally liturgical, and that's illustrated in the Book of Common Prayer. Anglicanism is a biblical church too, and that's illustrated in the King James Bible. So one of the things that we looked at last week, we looked a little bit at John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, who said, hey, if we want to have the people have access to the scriptures, and we do, it's going to be really important for that Bible to be in their own language. And so in 1604, King James I of England commissions a new translation of the scriptures, kind of the first like thoroughgoing scholarly translation of the Bible into English. This becomes known in England as the authorized version, because it's the version that is authorized for use in the church. But in the vernacular and in the United States, this becomes known as the King James Version of the Bible. And that illustrates something consequential about the Anglican community, is that they're interested, I should say, are interested in both the sacramental and the biblical aspect of things. And that doesn't happen very often in the Reformation era, to hold those together. The liturgical, the sacramental piece tends to be associated with the Roman Catholic Church, where the biblical focus tends to be associated with continental Protestantism, especially the Reformed Calvinist Protestants. And the Anglicans holding those together is somewhat unusual, and that's an aspect of the Anglican Via Media. I've got a fairly lengthy quote here from a very recent book on the Anglican communion. And I'll just read this out because I think it illustrates a way of looking at Anglicanism. It says, the concept of the Anglican Church as Reformed Catholicism can be seen in Article 19 of the 39 Articles of Religion, which defines the Church of Christ as a congregation of the faithful, where the pure word of God is preached and the sacraments are duly ministered according to Christ's ordinance. The Reformed Catholicism of Anglicanism is indeed embodied in her two great legacies to the English-speaking world: the King James translation of the Holy Scripture, that is the early Church's apostolic witness, and the prayer book translation of the Church's liturgies, sacraments, and holy orders, that is the early Church's apostolic practice. Anglicanism has been compared, this is the metaphor that I think is interesting, to a child of the great divorce that was the Reformation, carrying the DNA of both of her parents, Catholic and Reformed. All members of the Anglican family share the same DNA. Some will combine traits from both parents in equal measure, while others will tend to resemble one parent far more than the other. But across the full spectrum of Anglicanism, there's always been an unmistakable family resemblance. So this is from Barbara Gardner. And I like this idea that there's this DNA, right? And some expressions of Anglicanism are more interested in the sacramental, and some are more interested in the biblical, but all expressions carry them both. And that's what we're going to see in the stories that I'm going to tell now about Anglicanism as a church that is broad and that includes multiple kinds of expressions of the Christian faith, including the very, very sort of biblical, right? Much more like the continental Calvinist Reformed, and including some that are very much more sacramental and much more like the Catholic Church. So our story begins for today with these guys, the Puritans. And you've probably heard of them. I like this picture because it's got this poor dude burning at the stake in the background and these kind of careless Puritans in the foreground. And the Puritans get kind of a terrible rap in popular parlance today as sort of the people who don't want you to have any fun, right? They're a little worried that someone out there might be having fun, and that would be problematic. And the term Puritan sometimes gets associated with a focus on purity of personal life, this idea that you need to live a pure life, which is not exactly where the term Puritan comes from. The Puritans were a movement within the Church of England, starting in the early 17th century, that suggested that the church needs to be purified, and it needs to be purified of those elements that were Catholic, or they would call it popish. So the Puritans wanted to have a less sacramental, less liturgical form of Christianity and a more Calvinist biblical style form of Christianity. And they become a major player in the 17th century in the church. They are Anglicans in the same way as the High Church Anglicans, but they become sort of aggressive in their promotion of their own particular ideals. I've got a list of some of the bits that are happening here. So with the Puritans, 1563, this is very early in English history. I like to use fancy terms because it makes me sound really erudite. The Vestiarian controversy has to do with basically whether the members of the clergy get to wear fancy vestments or should they wear really, really plain and ordinary clothes. And the Puritans said, no, the ministers shouldn't be wearing fancy schmancy vestments. They should be wearing very ordinary things, like regular people. Okay, not a particular theological issue, but in some ways a very important condensed symbol, because for the Puritans, this sort of vestment controversy is a sign of whether you're too much to the Catholic side, right? It's not so much whether you wear fancy clothes, but it's whether those clothes sort of identify you as being too far to one end of the spectrum. And there's a number of different kinds of controversies. One of them has to do with the particular scope of the rituals, whether you should light candles, right? All kinds of things that are in and of themselves not particularly consequential, but that become these condensed symbols of whether you're on the right team for the Puritans. Moving forward, the Puritans begin to question the governance of the church. This is actually fairly important because the Anglican Church is a state church, and so how the church is governed has political overtones. And in 1572, a gathering of Puritan church leaders issues a document called the First Admonition. There's actually a number of admonitions, but the First Admonition says, we really shouldn't have a church that's governed by bishops. They said, this is another one of those sort of condensed symbols, although governance is somewhat more important than whether or not the pastor wears a vestment, right? Because it has to do with how the church is run. And the Puritans started to question whether bishops should have a place in the church. Instead, maybe we should have elections to govern the church. This idea that the church should be governed by elected officials rather than by bishops who are sort of appointed and ordained in the older way becomes known as Presbyterian. That's the term that comes to describe this type of polity, this type of church organization. And a number of the Puritans want to adopt a more Presbyterian sort of church. Sometime later, one of the Puritans, his name is Robert Brown. I actually think his usually has a little E at the end of his Brown, B-R-O-N-E. I don't think it matters all that much. He found in England the first congregational church, right? And this is an even further step down the road of church governance, where instead of having a election across parishes, right? Brown says, no, this church is independent. It's governed by itself, and the members of this particular parish, this particular church, should choose their own leaders and should sort of govern themselves. And this question and the sort of related broader question of how should the church be organized and governed becomes a wedge between the Puritans and the more high church Anglicans, right? How should we have the church governed? In 1603, the Puritans seem to have sort of won a great, I don't know if this is called won a great victory, but they seem to have got ahead, because when Elizabeth dies, she doesn't have any heirs. She is famously the Virgin Queen. She does not have children of her own. So her heir is her nephew, King James VI of Scotland. Scotland is a country that has adopted a Calvinist church, a Presbyterian sort of church. And when this sort of Presbyterian Calvinist monarch becomes the King of England, the Puritans believe that this is the time, this is the place for us to sort of make these reforms to the church. I think maybe it's important to point out at this point that nobody at this point is thinking schism, right? The Puritans are thinking we need to further reform this church, but stay here, right? Stay in it. They're not thinking of sort of removing themselves from the Church of England. Okay. In 1604, the Puritans convince King James to call a conference at Hampton Court, which is one of his palaces. And this Hampton Court conference is the place where they propose the King James Bible, and that's where King James says, yes, let's have a new translation of the Bible. The Puritan divines at Hampton Court make a number of other requests of James, including let's limit the power of the bishops and let's kind of change church governance to look a little bit more Presbyterian. And James declines to do this for a number of reasons, but Hampton Court is a mixed success for the Puritans, right? They get their new translation of the Bible, or they get one of the things that was really important to them. But James turns out to be a bit more conservative and unwilling to change whole cloth the organization of the church. Okay, so James is not super popular with the Puritans, as it turns out. He's also not super popular with Parliament in England, right? England has a monarchy where the king has a great deal of power, but there's also a Parliament in England that shares power with the king. And James and Parliament don't get along particularly well. James manages that to some limited extent. But when he dies in the 1620s. He's succeeded by his son, King Charles, who does not manage his relationship with Parliament and the Puritans particularly well. And it leads to more significant conflict between the Puritans and the higher church Anglicans in England. 1620, I forgot I put this in there. This is actually consequential for American history too, because it is in the context of the Puritans who are in conflict with the monarchy in England, right? The monarch, King James, is not acceding to their requests to reform the church in a more pure way. That the separatists who want to form a more congregational or a more Presbyterian church actually leave England. And famously, a group of them set sail in 1620 and makes their way to New England. So that's the context for the Pilgrims in the United States. This is where I thought we were going. So in 1643, under King Charles I, a group of Puritans gather in Westminster for the Westminster Assembly. They create and promote a confession of faith, the Westminster Confession, which is very significant and becomes the confession of faith of Presbyterians and other sorts of Calvinist churches within the English-speaking world to this day. And at the Westminster Assembly, there is a level of defiance against the monarchy, because the monarchy at this point is seen as not, or as standing in the way of properly reforming the church in a more biblical Calvinist way. And this comes at the cusp of a great civil war in England. There's the Westminster Divines. They look very nice. I don't know who this chap is that's looking straight out at us. I think he's striking. But they're messaging their confession of faith here. But it leads to a civil war in England. And the English Civil War is in many ways a religious war. One of the things that happens in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation is, as different states and different political leaders adopt different religious positionings, it leads ultimately to actual warfare. And so there's wars on the continent, in Germany and in France and in the Netherlands about this. And in England, they've got a similar conflict. And so there's a civil war that breaks out in 1642 that is over two really consequential and overlapping questions. It's a conflict over what kind of church England ought to have, and it's a conflict over how England ought to be governed. Here's why it overlaps. Parliament tends to be Puritan or sympathetic to the Puritans. And so the members of Parliament want to impose a more reformed church in England, a more sort of Calvinist church in England. The monarch at this point, Charles I, does not. He wants to have a more high church Anglican church, one that is more over towards the liturgical and sacramental side of things. And so that's a conflict. And the conflict is also between Parliament and the king over who should have political power, because Parliament believes that the king's power should be balanced by Parliament, that the Parliament should have real government power. And the king wants to rule as a monarch. So this little woodcut here has the here's the monarchists over here with their lion, and here's the Puritans over here with their dog, and they're getting ready to have a war with each other. The Puritans were called Roundheads in the English Civil War, which I think is just a fun name for people, and it's because they wore their hair short. You can see the monarchists over here had long flowing locks, which was kind of a sign of their aristocratic bearing. And they said, oh, your hair is so short, it makes your head look really round. And the Puritans were like, that is correct. We are the Roundheads. That's an aside. The Civil War is this conflict that is both political and religious. The religious aspect, which we're interested in, is should England go whole hog into a Puritan, basically Calvinist Protestant church, or on the other hand, should we try and retain something of this via media, where you've got both the biblical and the liturgical space? Okay. The Puritans win. They have a victory in the Civil War. In 1649, King Charles is captured after the Battle of Naseby, and after a series of sort of trials and negotiation, the Puritan leadership in Parliament decides that we can't have a king anymore, and that having Charles around is even too much. So King Charles is executed. He's beheaded in January of 1649 in front of the banqueting house. This is the kind of contemporary woodcut of that. And the Parliament wins, the Puritans win. So this is 1649. It seems like England has gone very much to the biblical Puritan reformed side of things. The leader of England after the execution of King Charles is Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell is himself a Puritan and a sort of a dedicated religious fellow. He does not take the title of king. He rather takes the term Lord Protector of the Realm. He declares England to be a commonwealth or a republic with no king. And he governs more or less as a military dictator for about 10 years. And under Cromwell, he sort of enforces by governmental fiat a more Puritan, more reformed Calvinist form of Christianity, which includes kind of getting rid of a lot of the bishops and purifying the rites of the church. It also includes, famously, he outlawed the celebration of Christmas. And my students think this is like the weirdest thing ever. Like, why would he do that? Because he said, well, the birth of our Savior is a time for sort of, solemn reflection and not, merrymaking. Closes down the theaters, right? And so he installs a rather strict regime of sort of both behavioral and doctrinal regulations in order to kind of enforce this one side of the equation. He's unpopular. I mean, he has some popularity at the beginning, but he quickly loses popularity because people tend to sort of resist things like, well, we like Christmas, we want to celebrate Christmas. But he stays in power because he's a military dictator. He rules through the army. When he dies, though, the army leaders recognize that this is an unsustainable circumstance. And like under Queen Mary, who did things in kind of the opposite way 100 years before, the people don't support this sort of aggressive, one-sided religious settlement. So the army invites Charles's son back to be restored. And so in 1660, do I have Charles II? There he is. In 1660, Charles II returns to the throne in England. And he more or less restores the older, more moderate form of the Church of England, in which you've got both the liturgical and the sacramental side and the biblical side. Charles is himself a fairly modest ruler. He recognizes that, hey, we don't want to have another revolution. They chopped my father's head off for being sort of difficult to work with. So he's a fairly easygoing guy. But in a story that you may recognize as becoming familiar, he doesn't have a son, he doesn't have an heir. So when he dies, he's succeeded by his brother, James, the Duke of York, who becomes King James II. And there he is. And James is like an actual, like, bona fide Catholic, because James was the son of King Charles I and was raised in France. The royal family sort of fled to France after the execution of Charles I. And James was raised Roman Catholic. And when he comes to the throne in England, he's the first Catholic ruler since Queen Mary. And the Puritans and other sort of more reformed folks in Parliament are very nervous about this. They're not, they allow him to be on the throne, partially because it looks like the next in line after him is his daughter Mary, who is reliably Protestant. Incidentally, this is where political parties come from in England. The first political parties in Parliament were pro-James and anti-James parties, which become known as Whigs and Tories. So he comes to the throne, but eventually he has a kid, and he's going to raise the kid Catholic. And there is this sense that we might actually in England be under not just kind of a middle of the road via media, but a actual Catholic monarchy. So Parliament there steps in, and Parliament says, we really don't need to have any Catholic monarchs. And they invite James's daughter, Mary, and they say, come back to England, take over, we're going to oust the Catholic king, and you can be in charge. And there's William and Mary. So Mary is his daughter, her husband, William, they come to the throne as sort of joint monarchs. This is called the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, Parliament asserts its right to sort of rebalance the religious settlement in England by ousting a Catholic monarch and bringing in a Protestant monarch who's going to be more willing to take this middle road. Shortly after the Glorious Revolution in 1688, William and Mary pass a Bill of Rights. And it's the first sort of written Bill of Rights in modern history. It's the model for the US Bill of Rights. And it includes things like the freedom of speech like we have, but it also includes in the English Bill of Rights the caveat that all English monarchs henceforward must be Protestant. They must be members of the Church of England. We won't accept Roman Catholic monarchs. So this is a big story, and I've run through it very quickly. I want to point out, though, a couple of aspects here, right? You'll notice that the Church of England sort of kind of veers back and forth a little bit between the two extremes. And you've got a strong group of Puritans who want to move in one direction with the church, and they kind of overstep themselves under Cromwell and recognize that the populace doesn't support kind of pegging it over to one side. But then you've got the other direction as well. And you've got King James, who is, actually Catholic. They say, well, we don't need that either, right? And so there's a kind of a balance, kind of a shifting towards the middle in the English kind of 17th century. So that's kind of the 17th century picture. There's two other kind of areas of Anglicanism that are relevant, I think, to this question of Anglicanism as a broad church, a church that tries to hold together both sides, the kind of really sort of Protestant biblical side and the liturgical sacramental side. And the first one is in the 18th century, there is what comes to be known as the evangelical revival in the Church of England. This chap is William Wilberforce. You may have heard of him. There was a well-liked movie about him that came out a little while ago, actually probably like 15 years ago now. He's a member of Parliament, and he is associated with a group of Anglicans called the Clapham sect, because they met in a church in Clapham, which is a part of London. And the Clapham sect is a group of people within the Church of England who want to assert more social reform into the the church. So Wilberforce, who is this guy here, he is famous for his opposition to the slave trade. But it's much, much more than that. The Clapham folks wanted to embrace better rights for women. They wanted to embrace sort of animal welfare. Wilberforce was as interested in stopping animal cruelty as he was in ending the slave trade. And so there's a strong bit of social reform that comes out of Clapham. And these guys said, look, if we want to be biblical, right, we've got to take this seriously and act on it in the real world. And so there becomes a strong sort of activist strain within some bits of Anglicanism. That's going to be consequential in the missions world. Okay, and these guys are probably kind of leaning a little bit more towards the biblical, more reformed pole in Anglicanism than the sacramental pole, because they're going to say, you know, acting is more important than ritual. Also at this point in the 18th century evangelical revival is this guy. You may know him, or you may know of John Wesley. John Wesley was an Anglican minister. Part of that evangelical revival, part of that sort of leaning more biblical, more Protestant. And Wesley was a preacher. He has an experience of the Spirit filling him. He was rescued from a fire as a child, and he begins to preach in that same kind of category as Wilberforce, as someone who is striving to reform the world. And he goes out to, he's famous for going and preaching in the open air, because he says, we need to get the word, we need to get it to everybody, to regular people. As such, he's kind of echoing back to Wycliffe and the Lollards. He comes to the United States and starts to do a lot of this sort of frontier preaching to spread the gospel. And Wesley ultimately ends up sort of gently breaking away from the Anglican Church, and the followers of Wesley become Methodists. Wesley kind of believes that there's a particular sort of method. Wesley, I don't think, intended to form a new church. Rather, when he was abroad, he began to sort of deviate from the hierarchy of the bishops. And so he would appoint new priests and new bishops without sort of oversight and approval. And the Methodist movement sort of gradually slipped away from Anglicanism. And there's also some doctrinal pieces that Wesley sort of included. But this is another example of how the Church of England or the Anglican movement could embrace broader and different expressions of Christianity. In this case, the Wesleyans, the Methodists don't remain within the Anglican fold, but Anglicanism sort of birthed this movement. So we've got the evangelical revival, this kind of moving a little bit towards the Protestant biblical pole. In the 19th century, you have something that moves the other direction with this cat here, John Henry Newman, who is an Anglican bishop. He later converts to Roman Catholicism. Spoiler alert, I should have saved that for the end. But the Oxford movement is a group of mostly sort of scholars within the Anglican Church that are concentrated in Oxford University, who are on the other pole. These are guys that are closer to the liturgical, sacramental, more Catholic pole of Anglicanism. And they say, look, if we want to reform the church, we want to renew the church. This is the 19th century, and the world is becoming more secular at this point. So if we want to renew the church, what we need to do is we need to renew her liturgy. We need to renew the sacraments. We need to restore some of this Catholic element of the Anglican Church. And so the Oxford movement is sort of the counter reform movement to the evangelical renewal movement. And I think that together they illustrate both of those poles, right? The Anglican movement can embrace someone like Wilberforce or someone like Wesley, who are reformers and are trying to be much more Protestant, much more biblical, and that can embrace something like Newman, who is much more sort of Anglo-Catholic. Newman does ultimately, his his argument starts that, hey, Anglicanism has a lot to learn from Catholicism. We need to move more towards Catholicism. And he ultimately comes to the conclusion that, well, there really isn't any distinctiveness in Anglicanism. And so we might as well go completely Catholic. And he converts to the Catholic Church. He is named a Catholic cardinal. So the Oxford movement, like Methodism, sort of branches out of Anglicanism proper. So that's my huge summary of some of these elements. And what I think we should see here is that Anglicanism has, I want to say struggled, but I'm not sure that's exactly the right characteristic. There are these poles, these two sides of Anglicanism, the two bits of DNA, as we pointed out in that quote at the beginning, right? There's that kind of sacramental liturgical DNA, and then there's that biblical Protestant DNA. And they come in different weights and different measures throughout history in Anglicanism. And in many ways, that's kind of the genius of Anglicanism, as that via media, as a movement that can embrace both of those and that can strive to kind of hold them together. And so, to segue into my final sort of piece here, some of that comes to fruition in the spread of Anglicanism worldwide. My third point is Anglicanism is a missionary church, right? One of the striking things about Anglicanism is this began as an English state church. It began as a particularly and peculiarly English form of Christianity associated very closely with the English state, but has, excuse me, by the 20th century spread worldwide. And you have Anglican churches not just in England, but all throughout Europe, Africa, all throughout Asia and the Americas, right? So Anglicanism spread worldwide. I would like to think that at least some portion of that spread has to do with the fact that Anglicanism is an expression of Christianity that is flexible because it has the ability to hold together some of these poles, these two poles. So there's three ways I'm gonna say that Anglicanism spreads. So it spreads worldwide. I think first of all, I'm gonna call it coincidental. Actually, this is not from me. I got this from a scholar who laid it out like this. But Anglicanism spreads because the British spread, right? It is the English form of Christianity, and coincidentally, the British become the world's largest empire by the early 20th century. So this is the British Empire in 1900, and where the British sent their colonial administrators and they sent their military, those English people brought with them their expression of Christianity. That's how Anglicanism comes to the United States. The United States begins its life as British colony, and these British folks brought their Anglican Christianity with them. And everywhere that you have British colonies, you tended to get those administrators and those colonial officials bringing Anglicanism with them. Now, for a lot of them, this is simply we're bringing our church so that we, the sort of expatriate British, can worship in our particular way. But it spreads to locals as well. Starting in about the 18th century, you end up with missions societies. And a lot of groups are formed. The most prominent one is the Church Missionary Society, the CMS, which still exists today. And the Church Missionary Society is founded because members of that evangelical renewal in Anglicanism, people like William Wilberforce, they said it's important for us not only to bring our churches with us worldwide so we can worship, but to share the gospel with the people whom we govern. And so the Church Missionary Society begins to move around, especially Africa, but also the British possessions in India and Asia, founding churches and striving to share the gospel with those persons who live there. This is an engraving from the Church Mission Society of a missionary preaching to some locals. I actually have a hard time not envisioning Katharine Hepburn from The African Queen when I'm thinking about these church missionary societies. I know that's not maybe the best vision of it. But this is part of that evangelical renewal. These missionaries, the most famous one that is associated here is a guy named David Livingstone, who's actually Scottish, but he's sent out by the Anglican Mission Society. And they're actually less concerned about making sure that everyone is particularly Anglican in the sense of the liturgics and the peculiarities as they are about spreading the gospel itself. So the Church Missionary Society worked very, very closely with German Lutherans and with Americans and with other groups that are not particularly Anglican. And they were quite successful in founding churches that were Anglican, but also very, very broad in their scope. So those are your kind of earlier missionary societies. I am going to time it as I wanted to. The third missionary group are more formally Anglican missions. And so the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG, is the kind of higher church mission organization. This is its seal over here of the sort of ship sailing off to parts unknown. These are a couple of SPG missionaries. The SPG functions substantially or significantly in Africa. And they are much more kind of explicitly Anglican than the earlier Church Mission Society. And they are sent in particular to form sort of careful, sort of apostolically succession. That's not really, that's badly formed sentence, but churches within kind of historic Anglican liturgical practice and sort of carefully connected to the particular Anglican way of doing church. And they operate in the kind of late 19th and early 20th centuries and found a number of colonial churches that become affiliated with the Anglican Communion. And so the Church of England is kind of the head church, but there are a number of, and I think at this, by right now, there's like 50 or 60 specific churches within the Anglican Communion. Each colony or each ultimately independent state sort of received its sort of particular Anglican church to such an extent that by now this is kind of Anglican membership, Anglican churches worldwide. And you'll notice if you look at these numbers, that numbers of Anglicans, like particularly Anglican Christians, are incredibly high in Africa. There are more Anglican Christians in Nigeria than there are in the UK. And so there's just these incredibly large and thriving Anglican churches that are decidedly Anglican outside of the UK. So we'll conclude here with a movement that has moved from being a peculiarly English kind of state church in the 16th century to a worldwide expression of Christianity that strives and in a lot of ways succeeds in balancing two sort of poles, right? Between the kind of liturgical heritage of Roman Catholicism and the biblical heritage of sort of continental Protestantism. Okay, so I aimed at 45 and I made it. I hit 45. So I'm going to end the screen share and we should have 15 minutes for Q&A or conversation. I did prepare a outline. Did that get posted? If not, I'll post it in a moment. Kevin, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, moving back toward the beginning of today's presentation. How was it, if I'm understanding it properly, that Cromwell and Cranmer worked together, given Cromwell's orientation?
So Cranmer was dead by the time Cromwell ruled England.
Okay.
So there is another Cromwell, a different Cromwell that was. So if you've read like the Hilary Mantel books, there's a guy named Thomas Cromwell. I think it's Thomas, who was an advisor to Henry VIII.
Got it.
And
so I had the wrong Cromwell.
so that Cranmer and Cromwell were together, but Oliver Cromwell is another generation.
Thank
later.
you.
So I've posted my notes if anyone is interested in those, and I'm happy to take other questions or comments or reflections. Teresa, go ahead.
Yeah, so since the Puritans didn't like the bishops, was it because the bishops weren't doing their jobs, or were they corrupt, or what was going on for them not to like the bishops?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that, and sort of the snarky answer, is I think the bishops were a little bit like vestments and ceremonials, is that the Puritans saw them as, I keep using the term condensed symbol, right? It's not that they particularly object exactly to having this polity, but it's so associated with kind of a expression of Christianity that they are opposed to, that they oppose it sort of shorthand. And of course, we do the same thing sort of politically. I mean, it's very much like our political discourse today, where there are certain things that become just, that's a symbol of they're the other, right? It identifies someone as the other. And I think that's a large part of it. I think you probably are right, though, that there's an argument against bishops that is that's built upon sort of the freedom of the believer, right? The idea that it can be a corruption to have bishops, especially because this is a state church, right? So the bishops are closely tied with the government. And so I think there's something to be said for people saying, we really want to have our own way of governing ourselves and not be forced into something by government officials whom we don't trust. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. It's just interesting to think, the opposite extreme, you just have a congregation that's completely independent and they run the show, but where do you have the oversight? And certainly if you have bishops doing oversight, they can err, but there's a multitude of them, whereas an independent church, who's going to make sure that church doesn't lead the congregation to heresy?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And the Anglican communion ultimately comes down in favor of that latter position, right? That bishops, while fallible, are an important element of keeping the faith on the straight and narrow, right? Of having that oversight in the church. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. This was really wonderfully done. I'm involved in missions in my church and in relative to the course called Perspectives. And so we're doing a lot of the rehearsing of mission advancement of the gospel Protestant side. And I also, as you may know, that I was in Rwanda for 10 years and very much aware of the Anglican communion in Rwanda, and that you guys are descended from that in a way of speaking. Wanted to know, in that history that you just traced of the development of the Anglican communion in Africa, you showed that map. Rwanda is too tiny to be represented on the map. But I have friends who talk about the, I think, 1950 area time revival, which was, I think, Anglican, and which just resulted in a huge surge of renewal and faith. Can you connect those things for me?
Yeah, I mean, I am not familiar with a 1950s renewal in Africa, although that's likely just because that's not something I've encountered myself. I do know that one of the, and of course we are, our parish was originally a missionary parish of the Rwandan Anglican Church. And so we do have that fundamental connection. And yeah, so I don't know about that particular thing, the particular event that you're talking about, but of course Anglicanism is a really prominent, I guess, expression of Christianity in certain parts of Africa. And maybe because the 50s and 60s are when these African states were becoming independent of their colonial governors. And I wonder if there might be a connection there, that the revival was coincidental with independence and with the church becoming sort of more autonomous from the English church. And I suspect, although I don't know for sure, that this may be the era in which the leadership of the various African churches was coming to be led by African persons. So, I mean, those are kind of my guesses, but I'm not familiar with that particular story.
Just one quick follow-up question. I'm sorry, Kevin. You focus all along in the history of Anglicanism or English Church being a state church, and the Pilgrims and others Protestant offshoots sort of moving out from that. But I'm wondering if you'd explain a little about how it came about that Anglicanism is no longer a state, except it is in England, I guess. I'm not real clear about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a huge question. And in England, it remains the official state church, although for the last like 30 or 40 years, it has not had any actual government power. So it used to be that bishops would sit in the House of Lords and have actual sort of legislative power. That's no longer the case, but it is the case that churches are supported fiscally by the government, and that it is sort of officially the state church. In most of the rest of the Anglican Communion, though, that's not the case. Mostly because it didn't develop that way. It was sort of a particular English church. In the United States, we ended up with for a while in certain states in the Eastern Seaboard where it was kind of what became the American Episcopal Church was kind of a de facto, although not legally, state church. So I mean, I'm not sure that's exactly the question. What I think is interesting, and maybe this is completely tangential to what you're asking, is that you develop, the Anglicanism develops in the world outside of England as a church that is trying to kind of hold together the best of all of these different worlds. And it becomes really sort of non-political in a lot of ways, in the sense that it was political in England. I'm actually a little troubled by state churches. I'll be frank, because I wonder how a church is going to hold the state accountable. Is going to be able to use the power in a circumstance where they're too closely tied to the state. But that dynamic doesn't seem to be the case even in England in 2020.
Thank you.
Rob, real quick, can I advance a resource to everyone?
Absolutely.
These are such rich, and difficult tensions as we think about the nature of empire, colonialism, the Church of Christ. I teach a class called Post-Colonial Literature at Northwest. I use this book called Missions and Empire. I'll put the details below. But, the narrative I got in grad school was the Anglican Church. This is my beloved daughter. Just 1 second. Let me say my bit here, and then I'll help you out with a drink of water. All right. Maybe Kevin should go. Okay. I'll make you some tea. She wants tea, so she is British. No, the narrative I got in grad school is that the Anglican Church was just an instrument and an arm, an extension of empire, right? And this collection of essays actually refutes that thesis pretty decidedly in ways that I wasn't expecting, and really illustrates how those who are kind of committed to the gospel and to Christ were often the only voices that were speaking on behalf of peoples who were being oppressed and just rankly exploited by the mission of empire. And so it was very helpful in my thinking about that tension, Gene, that you're sifting through, thinking through with a lot of acumen. So I will put enough for me. I'll put that in the chat. Yeah, it's been a
Thank you
great
so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Kevin, I'm sorry. You're so great.
No, I was waving. I was waving to Maddie. I wasn't trying to interrupt you.
I'll just leave. I'll put her on.
Gene, back to your original question, and I don't know if I'm answering it correctly because I'm not sure of the dates, but there was the East African revival that brought millions in.
That's it.
And that had both Anglican and Pentecostal elements.
Okay.
At the same
Yes.
time.
Exactly. That's the one I was referring to.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah.
So it's about noon. We probably got time for another question or two. I'm willing to stick around if you have them, but we're about at our sort of posted time. So.
This has been great. Thank you for the
Well,